So net zero by 2050. We've heard it from governments, we've heard it from companies. But what does it mean? And are they really doing what they say they're going to do? Well, there's the definition that the government of Canada put together. And what it essentially is we've got to either make no emissions, or if there are emissions from something, because we can't change the way a process works, we've got to do something to remove that same amount of emissions from the atmosphere in order at the end of the day that we have added and taken away nothing. So first of all, we need to just look at how emissions are measured. We divide them up into three scopes. In scope one, this is the emissions that we directly make. So let's assume that we have a factory. We own a factory. We take in some natural gas and some electricity to run the plant. We bring in some raw materials. The natural gas that we burn there has emissions. Those emissions are part of our scope one emissions. The electricity, we use that up, and there's no emissions directly from that. There's emissions made when somebody made it in the first place, but that's going to come separately. That's under scope two. So scope one is just what it comes out from us directly, not what is coming in, something that's ready made for us. So then scope two, this covers all emissions resulting from feedstocks and parts, maybe that come into our factory, or things like electricity. It's somebody else makes those emissions, but those are also counted as part of our sort of overall emissions, if you like, for what we do. And then there's scope three. And if you're in the business of, let's say, making gasoline, most of the emissions are associated with when it's used at the end of the day and when it's used to drive cars. So those are called scope three. So we try to divide them up like that because you want to make certain that everything is counted, but not double counted. So if you were to get every company and every person in this country to identify their scope one emissions and to add them together, that's what we do as a group. That is really what is coming out. Scope two, those are things that other people are doing for us, but they're doing them here as well. So then we'll look at the targets that the government has set. 40 to 45% reduction by 2030, which is now less than sort of 8 years away, 7, 8 years away. And then net zero by 2050. Now, those are the targets. They say they've been doing a lot to push those along. In 2019, we had an emission target there, reducing emissions by 29 million tons. Anybody want to guess what we actually did in 2019? Yeah, no, it actually got worse. We actually added to it. We said we would reduce by 29, and it got worse. But we're in good company. Look at the G10. The target for all, sorry, G20, the target for all of those countries in there. And some of them did quite well, right? But look at that. 1.350 million tons extra above our target. So our industry's plans realistic? We're running out of time. We've got this constraint coming up, but we're still sticking with this idea that we're going to do all of this. So there was a report done just recently that was published in Corporate Knights magazine. And it's Corporate Responsibility Report. Looked at 25 of the world's mega companies. These are big international companies. And looked at their plans, what they were doing to reduce their emissions. As I say, it went from Amazon to Volkswagen. You can imagine the size of these companies. Well, only 13% of them rather, had set a real goal in there as to what they were going to reduce, the reductions they were going to make. And that's one of the criteria that's often used to sort of suggest, are we being reasonable or not? Are we looking at really being able to do something? And those 13, they were just going to reduce emissions by 40% by 2050, not the 100% that is needed. Only one company out of those 25, and remember, these are all huge companies with huge resources and indoor engineering groups. Only one had a net zero pledge that was reasonably of reasonable integrity. Let's grab a drink here. Three more were deemed to be of moderate integrity.
Here.
Yes.
I'm struggling to hear.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's because I forget all about the microphone. All right, how's that? Okay, sorry. Thanks for pointing that out on that. So 10 had low integrity, and the remaining 11 had very low integrity. So again, these are companies that have all the resources that they need to do it, but they have not planned to do it. The findings of the report, well, there was a disappointment at the lack of integrity in the plans. They were lazy, suspect, or in some cases outright misleading. Contentious plans to reduce emissions somewhere else. You've heard this one a number of times from groups that say, we'll take our LNG, we'll send it over to China, where it will replace coal, and then we'll claim some emissions reduction based on that. Right, so it's a little mythical sometimes as to whether or not the reduction is going to take place wherever you're going, whether it's really going to achieve anything. And there's a lot of these plans that rely on somebody else doing something. They hid some critical information, used outright accounting tricks, double counting, all kinds of different things. In conclusion, we're fooled into believing that these companies are taking sufficient action when anything else is far from the truth. And so again, these were 25 really big companies. The only one that was any good was Maersk, the Danish shipping company. But they were all of that kind of magnitude. So energy forecasts. Now, we've got to look at most of the emissions that are related to our consumption of energy. So the forecasts, and these are just some that I picked off just almost randomly. They're all recent ones. Canadian oil production to grow 1% annually after 2021. Oil sands production up 45% by 2035. Investments in oil and gas going up, right? Production up 7% by 2050. Global energy demand to grow 47% by 2050, with oil as the top source. How can this be happening while we're supposed to be reducing emissions at the same time? This is like there's two different worlds here. There's one where it's business as usual and they carry on, and there's another one where we're actually going to do something to reduce emissions. And reducing the consumption of things like oil and gas means we have to replace the energy used with green electricity, really, which means that we've got to increase the size of our electricity production by about a factor of 2 or 3. And that's not happening. Nobody is planning for this kind of increase to take place because they don't really think it's going to happen. And we've got to start off by replacing all of the current equipment that is producing emissions itself. And then we've got to build all these new generating facilities in order to cover off the reduction in oil consumption. So there's a huge disparity between what we're talking about and what's really going on. The numbers don't add up. So we're forecasting increased oil and gas production and consumption, but at the same time, we're going to say we're going to be net zero by 2050. What assumptions is somebody in there making that as to how we're going to do this? How can we burn more oil and gas and produce no emissions? If you remember back to that original statement by the government of Canada, that means that we would have to have emissions reductions in some place. some way of getting emissions out of the air, right, locking them back in order to offset all of the emissions from burning oil and gas. Well, where are those carbon credits going to come from? There's an assumption built into this that there's going to be a huge amount of credits available for something. And there's only a few ways we can make those credits. There's things like adding additional carbon to the soil. There's reforestation, building more and more trees. And then carbon capture and storage, which is the one that we've all been hearing a lot about. But let's first just look at reforestation. And this was just a random comment that I found somewhere. It would take offset just 15% of BP's ongoing emissions. You need a forest the size of Ghana. What they're trying to say is we cannot grow enough forests to get ourselves out of this. That is not going to happen. There are some things we can do with forests, obviously. We need to stop deforestation, first of all. We need to avoid these mega fires that we've been going through. And the emissions on some of those are absolutely huge. We need more tree coverage. And we talked about that in this city, and the group, the Climate Action Group, is doing a lot of work with planting trees. We need to make certain that the cities are more livable, that we avoid getting these heat islands, we need areas where there's shade. And obviously, they also reduce air pollution. And we mustn't forget here, we need trees, we need lumber, because it's good carbon-free building materials. And that if we can use wood for things, it means we're not using plastics or something else. So capturing CO2 from the air, or from concentrated streams, that's what we're looking at here with what's termed carbon capture and storage. And then when you've got that CO2, you do one of two things with it. Well, either you can use it, and there are some companies that can use it actually as an input to a process where they're making something, perhaps an artificial fuel. You can use it to feed algae that are collecting sunlight, and again, you can use the algae then to make the fuel. But most of it is being used for enhanced oil production, which is rather sad, and that is that the piece that we're doing at the moment, the emissions we're reducing at the moment, are just being used to produce more oil. Or the permanent solution, or at least we think the permanent solution, is to take that carbon dioxide, to pressure it down to about 1,000 pounds a square inch, and put it back into the wells in the ground. All the places where we found oil and gas, and which stored that oil and gas for the millions of years that it's been there, to use those areas basically to store the carbon dioxide. Now, the theory is that will work, and I have some concerns with it myself. I mean, one of the things to think about is if you think of a gas well that's perhaps been developed over time and been all the gas has been taken out of it. In the process of doing that, we've drilled a bunch of holes in it. We fractured it in order to get the gas out. It is not the same well that it was when it held that gas for several 100 million years. Right? We've now opened it up, and in many cases, we don't even know how many times it was drilled into. We don't know whether all of those wells were sealed off properly. So there's potential there that we may go putting stuff in the ground thinking that we're getting rid of it, only to find that it's just leaking out again somewhere else. There are opportunities, though, in actual fact, to turn that carbon dioxide into a solid carbonate chemically. And some of the wells will actually do that if they've got water and sort of saline wells. You can actually do that. So removing carbon dioxide from the air or from concentrated streams has been done for about 25 years. Unfortunately, at the moment, only about 0.1% of our total emissions is being extracted that way. And most of that, as I said, is being used for oil enhancement. Currently, it's very expensive to do, and there's a plant in Iceland that every year puts aside, I think, about 600 or 700 tons of carbon dioxide. But the cost of that is somewhere around $500 per ton. And if you were to add that to the cost of gasoline, that would add $1.15 to the cost of each liter of gasoline. Right, so paying $500 to get rid of a ton of carbon dioxide is not practical by any means. There are arguments that costs will come down once we build bigger plants. And, that's true in part, but many of the savings that they're looking at making there are on the assumption that we'll have a lot of green energy, green electricity that will be at a low cost. And the obvious argument is that if we've got lots of low-cost green electricity here, why on earth are we burning gasoline in order to then spend more of our energy to clean up the emissions associated with burning the gasoline? It doesn't make any sense. But this is the route on which we're traveling at the moment. The oil and gas companies are pressuring the government to spend more on research on carbon capture and storage, because they're looking at that as a potential solution. You've got to remember that for the oil and gas companies, their future really depends upon being able to continue making and selling their products. None of them want to go out of business. They're all looking at how can the future contain as much oil and gas consumption as possible. And they're looking at this as a way of justifying that, if you like. So what are the conclusions looking at all of these things? Well, first thing is governments are failing to meet targets. They're just not focused on targets. And very few countries are doing well, most are not. Industry is not planning for a real net zero. The two sides just do not make sense. The numbers don't add up. Oil and gas producers are looking to sell more of their product, not less of it, and to somehow convince us that what else they're doing is going to be able to take those emissions out of the air. It's very difficult to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, because even though we're concerned about the levels of it that are in the air, we're talking about parts per million. So you've got to move an awful lot of the atmosphere through a plant in order to get the CO2 out of it. So it's not an easy task to do at all. If we have if we have low-cost green electricity, why on earth would we want to be using oil and gas? We want to use that better quality energy that's carbon-free rather than clean up after ourselves. So that brings me to the end. If that's confusing, I think it's perhaps for a reason. Governments, when they talk about this, do not lay this out in the same kind of way. The companies that are involved they make assurances, yes, we're doing. We're going to get net zero by 2050, but their plans don't take us to that point. So questions I think we're going to do afterwards. Is that right?
That's correct.
Good. Okay. Thank you.